Okay, I think we are live. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the next talk in our Let's Talk Primate series. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Huffman from Kyoto University, Japan. So, Michael Huffman received his MSc and DSc degrees in zoology from Kyoto University, Japan, and he's a tenured professor. Just a sec, please. So he's a tenured associate professor in the Department of Ecology and Social Behavior at the Primate Research Institute, Kyoto University. In addition to investigations in Japanese macaques spanning 40 plus years, he has extensively studied the behavioral ecology of wild chimpanzees in Tanzania and Uganda, with a focus on host-parasite ecology, zoonotic transmission, self-medication, and ethnopharmacology. He has a special interest in traditional medicines acquired from observations of wild animals for the control of parasitoses and related diseases. So he has published over 15 primate species from apes to lemurs, and he has worked in many different countries, and the list includes Japan, Taiwan, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, China, Thailand, Tanzania, Uganda, and South Africa, Madagascar, and Brazil. So there are a lot of countries. And he's deeply committed to building bridges through interdisciplinary collaborations and mentoring. So if you want to know more about his work, please visit his website at the Primate Research Institute website. And so I'll hand it over to Mike now for his talk. Mike,
hello.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thanks for listening in. I'm sure some of you will be catching this after the live stream, but it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to the audience of the Association for Indian Primatology. I'm a big fan of India and Indian primatologists. I'm always very eager to find out what everyone is doing. So now I have an opportunity to share a little bit with you about some of the things that I'm doing. I'll be showing a short video for about 8 minutes or so, just before I start the actual talk. But let me set up the video a little bit. It was produced several years back now for what is called the PBS Nature series in the United States. And since then, it's been aired internationally, I think. But it's a short 8-minute program within a larger movie, about an hour program that describes what we have learned from different animal species and how nature is teaching us new ways to create and to explore the planet. So this short documentary will take you to Tanzania, to the Mahale Mountains, where I did a lot of the work with chimpanzees that I'll be talking about today. And it will show you the habitat, the chimpanzees, of course, and a very special collaborator, Mohamed Issaif Karunde, who was a traditional healer and a National Parks game scout. And he was born and raised in that forest. So he knows the forest, the animals, and the plants very intimately. And because he's trained as a traditional healer, his work was very, very key in allowing the science to progress as it has over the years. So I'll let you start the video and enjoy that for the next couple of minutes.
Hidden in the remote mountain forest of Tanzania, there is a magical world. A world where creature and human share an ancient alliance. Here, the medicine men know how to read their forest, like a book. By watching the creatures around them, they have learned to heal their own people. They have found cures for everything from headache to arthritis. Their knowledge of remedies reaches deep into the jungle and deep into their past. For as long as the Watangwe people have walked the earth, they've observed wild animals using the medicines of the forest. They've known that a sick chimpanzee might know where to find a cure that could heal their own people. These observations from the past provide a wealth of knowledge still used today. Mohammadi Seifu Kalunde comes from a long line of traditional healers. A game officer in Mahali Mountains National Park, he is teaching the wisdom of his ancestors to a modern medicine man. His colleague, Dr. Michael Huffman, is a world-renowned scientist, a trailblazer in a new field of research.
Here at Mahale, Mohammadi and the chimpanzees themselves are my teachers, my instructors. We started out just following the chimpanzees, trying to figure out what the chimpanzees are doing when they're sick, how they heal themselves, and what we can learn from them, what kinds of plants they're using, the ways they're using the plants, in hopes that we too can use this to better the lives of people.
For over a decade, Michael and Mohammadi have been tracking the same group of chimpanzees deep within a 70-square-mile expanse of forest. Chimps are ideal models. Like humans, they're vulnerable to malaria, arthritis, even polio. But in his search for new medicines, Michael knows he's working against the clock.
This is one of the last places where the chimpanzee is safely protected, and they still have so much to learn. To wake up one day and see that all of this is gone would be like throwing away the last medical textbook.
With Mohammadi as his guide, 15 years ago, Michael found a clue he's been following ever since. They observed a sick chimpanzee eating the tender shoots of a tree to cure herself of parasites. Lab reports confirmed the tree had acted as a remedy. The chimpanzee had led Michael to the discovery of 13 entirely new compounds. Compounds with anti-cancer, antibacterial, and antiparasitic properties. It was a discovery that could have astounding consequences for the human race. More than half the world's population suffers from parasitic diseases, and the symptoms can be fatal.
This is what they were eating. It's the first medicinal plant that I found chimpanzees using. But when Mohammadi and I first saw the first incidents, it was Mohammadi that told me that when his people are sick, showing upset stomach, diarrhea, things like that, that they also use this plant, and it's a very important plant. It's amazing that humans and chimpanzees are using the same plant for the same thing. As a scientist, I'd like to think that I'm covering new ground, but in actuality, I'm retracing the footsteps of a very ancient civilization, both human and animal.
Within the tropical forest is a medicine cabinet waiting to be opened. In its archives are drugs like quinine, heart medications, and possible cures for cancer. By unlocking the wisdom of generations past, Michael hopes to secure a future for generations to come.
The observations that I made about 15 years ago of a chimpanzee using leaves to medicate herself sparked an idea to try and combine the wisdom of chimpanzees with the methodology of science so the cure will last forever. If I can do that, I'll be a happy man.
Following in the footsteps of medicine men before him, Michael Huffman continues his quest.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. It'll give you an idea of what the habitat is like, what the people involved in that study are like. And actually what I'll be talking about today couldn't be started off in a better way than with that video clip, because that's where all of this work with primate self-medication and all the work that I've done after that with other species really began, with the ideas from the work at Mahale and watching the first chimpanzee that I was able to follow and whatnot. So I'll get into those details. And today's talk is about the evolution of self-medication. It started out just in primates, but as this field has developed more and more, we understand now that every animal species on the planet probably is self-medicating in one way or another. And the central theme that seems to be drawing this all together, keeping it moving, is parasite infections. So much of what I'll be talking about today is the host and the parasite interaction. But there are a lot of other different things that animals may be using plants for besides parasites. But today I'll focus on the parasites, because we have such a rich body of information accumulating now about that host, parasite, and plant interaction. What you can see on the first slide there are 6 species that I've studied, that I've written about. The Japanese macaque, the gibbon in Thailand. This is howler monkey in Central and South America, and the muraki, a spider monkey. And on the bottom, you see the mountain gorillas, and you see chimpanzees. This chimpanzee is from Mahale in Tanzania. So let me get us started on this journey to understand how this ability to self-medicate has evolved, how many different species we have information for, how the commonalities are, and how habitats and different ecologies make some of the differences that really show how dynamic this system of behavior is. So first of all, we can't talk about self-medication without talking about medication. Where does that come from? How did that appear on the planet? Well, plants have to protect themselves as well. So they have anti-herbivorous strategies that prevent other animals from eating too much of their parts, so that they cease to function or cease to exist. So there's different ways that a plant can protect itself. And any forest you choose to walk into, you'll find examples of this anti-herbivory strategy. There are basically 2 different routes you can go. Some plants have both. One is secondary compounds, producing these secondary metabolites in different parts of the plant that make them not taste good. So it prevents animals, insects, that includes insects or herbivores, small and large, from over predating on the leaves or the fruits at the wrong stage of development. So you have a secondary compound strategy, and you also have a physical barrier. As you see on this picture on your right, this is from a scanning electron microscope. It's from an Aspilia species in the composite family, and it's full of tiny little hairs. All of those hairs are made of silica, glass, basically, and so they don't digest. And I'll talk about these 2 strategies and how so many different animal species are using these same plant strategies for themselves to eliminate parasites. So the story of self-medication began much earlier, but people weren't thinking about it in terms of self-medication. They were looking more at the ecological interaction, the chemical ecology of the interactions between insects and plants. And there's a lot of literature that was generated in the 60s and 70s onward that talks about these very specific relationships where plants and insects are very much interdependent. Insects, of course, pollinate plants, and that furthers the reproduction of the plants. But on the insect side, they need some of these secondary compounds to provide a number of very important functions. Sometimes insects will use the secondary metabolites as a way to make themselves, like the plants do to themselves, make them unpalatable, make them taste bitter, taste bad, so that their predators won't eat the insect the next time, or they will avoid eating that insect because it doesn't taste right. Other examples are actually for an insect to communicate to a member of the opposite sex to reproduce, it has to produce pheromones that advertise their readiness to mate, or just to attract a member of the opposite sex. But some insects can't produce those hormones, those pheromones, without an inducer from a plant. So you can see that this relationship is very, very, very integrated, so that insect and plant have co-evolved over a long period of time. But one of the earliest interactions that we're seeing there is that insects are using the plants to take those secondary compounds and protect themselves from parasites. And this is the interaction that we're seeing all the way up to humans. So you can see there's a long trajectory, very similar adaptations that have co-evolved perhaps over a very long period of time. Now, animal self-medication, many of you may have not heard of this term or know about this field in a lot of detail. So first, let me explain a little bit about what it actually is. It's a behavioral strategy. Animals will avoid or suppress disease transmission. They can treat or control disease or its symptoms, thus directly or indirectly enhancing their health and their reproductive fitness. There couldn't be another more basic, more fundamental, more important strategy for an animal to possess. For myself, the main goals for studying self-medication have been to understand what makes an animal sick in nature, how they respond to those threats, how effective are the behaviors in maintaining health, and how are the behaviors maintained within a population. And by looking at a number of different species across the animal kingdom, we can begin to understand and appreciate how these sets of behaviors have evolved over time. Have they changed drastically as the climate, as the habitats have changed? How much of it has been conserved over this entire period? Those are some of the big questions that I have. And as I have followed this line of research, I've interacted with a lot of traditional healers, a lot of people in traditional medicine in a number of different countries. And I've begun to realize that humans for a long time have been looking at animal behavior, looking at sick animals and using their behavior as a cue to find new plants that humans themselves, we ourselves can use to treat similar symptoms. And so this has something to do with how our own medicinal traditions have developed. Of course, humans are doing a lot of experimentation and exchanging information amongst themselves, but one very important source seems to have been throughout history, throughout prehistory, is to look at the behavior of animals, because animals are doing a lot of things to keep themselves healthy. So this new developing science is actually something that has been practiced for a long, long time. Now, currently we know 4 different modes of self-medicative behaviors across the animal kingdom. The first mode is the optimal avoidance or reduction of the transmission of diseases. That's why we're all wearing masks now in the era of COVID-19, to avoid passing on the virus if we have it, and also to help prevent from getting it ourselves. This is also used, a common practice in many parts of the world when you have the common cold or the flu. But animals also have ways of avoiding contact with disease. The second mode is a passive prevention. That's what I like to call it. It's the dietary selection of items with a preventative or health maintenance effect. Some things can be eaten in small amounts over the year or during specific times of the year. And I'll get into more detail about some of the behaviors and that timing in just a minute. Mode 3 is therapeutic treatment. It's like what you and I do if we have a cough, a sore throat, a headache. We take something to relieve those symptoms. So it's a very direct, a very limited, time-wise, very limited practice. We don't do it every day thinking that, oh, I'm going to get a headache today. I'm going to have a sore throat today, so I'll take this medicine now. It's once we get infected, once we feel uncomfortable, that we use these substances that can reduce those symptoms, sometimes actually directly get rid of the cause of those symptoms. And the fourth mode, fumigation, it's not just fumigation. I should probably modify this term a bit, but it's the use of plants not inside of the body, but outside or within the living space where you live. A bird that has a nest, they'll put things inside the nest to keep bacteria and ectoparasites down. Animals that live in burrows are doing the same thing, and I'll give you some examples of that. So there's these 4 different modes that animals can maintain, prevent, or treat disease. So first, I'll give you some examples of mode 2, what I call medicinal foods, the passive prevention. Here you see in Japanese, yakushoku dogen, means medicine and food are of the same origin. You'll find similar phrases in many different languages because most people traditionally have learned to identify the value of foods, not just to make your stomach full, not just to give you energy, but also to maintain proper health in different ways than just nutritionally. The idea for this topic, I borrowed the name medicinal food from cultural anthropologists studying how humans use food as medicine, but I found it to apply very nicely to what we're seeing animals doing as well. And the first opportunity I had to try and investigate and understand the extent of medicinal foods in the diet of a primate was the work that I did in Mahale. We had a dietary list, a plant food diet list of 172 species. So I began to look at, by this time I was focused on parasite interactions with primates. So I picked out of the ethnomedicinal literature all of the plant parts, the same parts that the chimpanzees were eating, with use by humans for the control or treatment of parasites. And what I found was 22% of the items that the chimpanzees were consuming were also used by humans in Africa, the same plant part, to treat or control parasite infections. So that gave me some ground to begin to explore this a little bit in more depth, look at other animal species, other primate species, and other non-primate species. And basically every species that we've looked at so far, we've found that this small part of the diet has these antiparasitic properties. Another example was with the Japanese macaques. A former graduate student, Andrew McIntosh, and I put together the databases for parasite infection and the food lists of 10 different populations across Japan, from the northern extreme in Shimokita Peninsula, which is temperate, very, very cold, severe winters, all the way down to Yakushima, the southernmost limit of the Japanese macaques. And it's a subtropical climate. So you have quite a range of habitats, quite a range of climate variation. And with that, we have a lot of variation in the diet because of plant availability, but also in the types of parasites that are infecting the Japanese macaques, the same species in all of these different populations. So first of all, this gives you an idea of the parasite richness, the number of different parasite species in Japanese macaques at each of these 10 locations. And you see, going from top to bottom, that Yakushima has the largest number of different parasite species. That's expected. It's a very moist, humid, subtropical habitat. Very, very good for parasites and makes their transmission in and out of the host much more effective. We go all the way to the top and we see they only have 2 different parasite species. In total, pretty much they all share similar types of species, but some populations have more parasites, some have less. So with that in mind, we looked at the diet and we, again, calculated these ratios. How much of the diet was medicinal against parasite infections and how much of it was some other medicinal property and how much of it had no medicinal properties at all. So basically, what we did was to take the number of plant parts in the diet with antiparasitic properties and correlated that with a number of different parasite species that in any population had. And as you can see, we had a very significant correlation. When we looked at plants with other medicinal properties, not antiparasitic properties, and correlated that with the number of parasites, there was no correlation with those 2 factors, strongly suggesting that there's something about parasites that it influence what kinds of plants they're ingesting. I'm sorry, the one in the middle, it says medicinal properties, but it's supposed to be no medicinal properties. I think the top part of the table there has been cut off. But as you would expect, overall, 78% of the diet of any of these populations has no antiparasitic property, or no medicinal property of any kind. It's basically consumed for food. So the majority of what they're eating is just as food. But there's that small proportion, 12 to 18% in Japanese macaques, that have an antiparasitic property. This was some of the different types of activities that we found in these 10 populations. 53% were treatments for gastrointestinal upset related to parasite infection, 22% antibacterial, 23% anthelminthic, 18% antiviral activity of some kind. You'll notice that this doesn't add up to 100. Some plant parts have multiple properties, which is the sign of a very bioactive plant. So that's an interesting addition to what we were finding, that some of these plants can have a very broad spectrum range of activity, and this can be beneficial to an animal in many different ways. We did another study on Yakushima from one single population, and we had 45 plant extracts that were consumed by one group, and a colleague in Europe did a number of different assays of very, very important parasite diseases affecting people in Africa and broadly across the tropics: malaria, leishmania, trypanosoma. And we found that over 80% of these extracts that we had selected from the medicinal foods of the Japanese macaques were very effective against malaria and leishmania donabani, 2 agents of very significant and important diseases that afflict humans in the tropics. We did another survey on the diets of all of the gorilla species, east, west, in Nigeria, and the mountain gorillas as well. And in this case, we didn't target just antiparasitic properties, but we looked at a range of different things. And we found that a small portion of the diet was indeed very effective against a number of different things, according to how humans use these plants, what is known from the laboratory. Some of the plants that they're ingesting are stimulants. They have high caffeine content, something that would help pick an animal up if it were overly tired or compromised from some type of illness, for example. Cardiotonics, an effect on the heart. Immunostimulants, tumor growth inhibitors, bactericides, fungicides, a lot of antiparasitic and antiviral activities as well. Interestingly, also hallucinogenic properties in just one species that the mountain gorillas are ingesting. And I'm sorry, it's not the mountain gorillas, it's the lowland in Central Africa. But we still don't have the context of how the animals are using these different properties in the forest. So we have to go back and try and figure out some of those things. But at this stage, we were just interested in seeing what animals can benefit from the diet other than nutrition. And we found in every species that we've looked at so far that there are some interesting properties. Also collaborated with some people in Brazil, with the macaque, and again, 24.5% of the plants that were being ingested by the macaque, the same plant part, were also used by local people as medicine. 5 of those were used as laxatives or purgatives, can help to expel parasites if that's what the problem was. But another 5 species had specific antiparasitic activities that are used by people living in the Amazon. So now we'll switch to mode 3. This is therapeutic treatment. So something that they take specifically, something that they do, either ingesting or well, for just now, we're limiting this to plants that are ingested, a therapeutic treatment. And again, we have this nice expression in Japanese, Ryoyaku wa kuchi ni nigashi. A lot of bioactive compounds in plants taste bitter. And the reason for that, the plant perspective is to make it not palatable so that animals won't eat too much of the plant, especially at the time when the plant doesn't want certain portions of it to be eaten. So what it means is good medicine is bitter. And that means that good medicine is good because it has this bioactivity in it, which is signaled by that bitter taste. A lot of things that suppress fever, that suppress headaches, inflammation, and also that lower fever have a bitter taste. So there's that taste and the property link that are connected, and you find that in many plants around the world. And they're all associated with specific secondary compounds of bioactive significance. As we saw in the video, the first medicine that I identified chimpanzees to be using was Vernonia amygdalina, and how the chimpanzees will use that bitter pith in small, limited amounts, and they'll experience recovery within 20 to 24 hours, which is exactly the time that the local people need for taking a roughly similar dose to find relief from the exact same symptoms that we were seeing in these chimpanzees that I was following. But the first case happened in 1987 in November, and it was of a chimpanzee called Chaoshiku. This is written up in the first report in 1989 in the journal Primates. But basically, over a period of 2 days, Mohammed and I were following this chimpanzee. It was within the first hour of the first day, something seemed not right, and asking Mohammedi what this new plant for me was that she was eating, and he explained it's called mujonso. When I went back to the station, was able to look up the Latin name for the Tongwe name, I realized that it was Vernonia amygdalina. And the more and more I looked in the literature, the more I became convinced that this wasn't eaten just for fun. It wasn't eaten as food. But during those first 2 days, the first observation, we were able to demonstrate only from behavior that the strength, the appetite of that individual had improved within 24 hours. And you can see from this diagram that a number of different basic behavioral patterns showed a very interesting change over that 24 hours when we compared to a control group of several individuals during the same time of year, same times of day. So we were able to show that, for example, at the very bottom, that in the section of foraging, Chaoshiku spent maybe 30% of the first afternoon that we saw her feeding, and most of that time was feeding on Vernonia amygdalina. So her appetite was not very good compared to the other animals. But that drastically shot up and improved on the second day in the afternoon. So by the second afternoon, she had her strength back. She could walk long distances. A very interesting change, very significant, clear change in her behavior after ingesting this plant that is known traditionally to be used by humans to treat very similar symptoms, and we're able to show that she recovered in the same period of time. So that was the first little bit of evidence that got me started on this long journey trying to understand how animals self-medicate. So by the next time I went back into the field in 1989, I was starting to look for ways to monitor and to quantify health in chimpanzees. So I was taking urine samples from urine that was dropped onto the forest floor, to collecting fecal samples to look at parasites, a number of different things, and just basic behavioral recording like we did in that first observation to try and document the health of many different chimpanzees to see what their normal condition was. And when that normal state crumbled, what kind of symptoms did they show? Because we were collecting fecal samples now, we could directly measure parasite load and try and understand if parasites were part of this problem. And it turns out that they very much were. So this is the first case to be able to document directly the change in parasite loads and the improvement of the stool quality. We were able to collect control data from other individuals looking at their parasite loads over similar periods of time. And then we're also beginning to look at the plant's chemistry and finding the most bioactive compounds from samples that I brought back in 1987. So by this time, we had a protocol waiting to try and document a clear case of another animal, a sick animal, ingesting the plant so that we could monitor how things change. And we were successful in doing that because we had a couple years to prepare for that. And basically, if you look at this figure here, it's 2 different years, 1991, 1992, 1993, and 1994. And this is looking at the parasite levels in several individuals over time. On top with the black bar graph, that's the monthly accumulative rainfall. And you can see that at Mohale, we have a long dry season and a concentrated rainy season. And all of the rises in these different peaks that we see are due to a rise in infection of a very important parasite, Esophagastomum stephanostomum. It was the only parasite that they have that we saw this similar pattern. And it coincided with their use of medicinal foods and with self-medicative behaviors, whether it was bitter pith chewing or another behavior that I'll explain in a minute, leaf swallowing. Both of those are targeted against this one very significant parasite. Now, when we started to do the chemistry for Vernonia amygdalina, it was well known in the literature that the sesquiterpene lactones, that's this group of compounds at the bottom of the screen there, were very significant in their anti-cancer properties and antibiotic activities, anti-amoebic properties as well. And this plant had been studied for probably close to a century because humans in Africa, all across Africa, use this plant. It's a very important medicinal plant for many different cultures. But when we started doing this work, we were looking at a plant part that people were not using as medicine. And what we found was 13 new compounds in a whole new class of compounds that hadn't been classified before. So my plant chemist colleagues were able to determine what they were, what their structure was, and that they were completely new to science. And they called them the steroid glucosides. Now I'll talk about this other type of behavior that's targeted by not just chimpanzees, but we found that bonobos and not mountain gorillas, but lowland gorillas in the east and the west. Every African ape species except the mountain gorilla, so thus far, has been shown to exhibit this behavior. Bitter pith chewing with Vernonia or other species so far has only been seen in 3 other populations, but leaf swallowing we see all across Africa. Whether this is our observations are a true reflection of actually what's going on, or whether people have just not looked close enough yet, we're not sure. But leaf swallowing is very widespread. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is now. Here you can see in the upper picture of these 2 photos, an adult male has got a plant and he's taking it to his mouth. And what they'll do is clip off the distal part of a leaf, and then within the inside of the mouth, they'll fold it over itself and they'll swallow it without chewing. And that picture that I showed you in the second slide of the leaf surface with all those little hairs made of glass, this species looks exactly the same. And what those little tiny trichomes, hairs made of glass, what's important about those is that plants produce a lot of those to protect themselves from being overeaten. But if an animal takes a larger animal takes a lot of those leaves into its mouth and doesn't chew them well, then they're not going to digest properly because of all that silica within the plant itself. But the animals that we see leaf swallowing understand that property, or they're taking advantage of those kinds of leaves for a specific effect. And basically what happens, normally when an animal, when a chimpanzee, for example, eats a bunch of leaves, chews them, eats fruit and whatnot, it'll take 24 to 35 hours for it to be digested and to pass through the system. But like clockwork, when chimpanzees fold and swallow these leaves, like you see at the bottom, in the bottom picture here, within 6 hours, everything in the intestinal tract is flushed out. And basically 2 leaves is enough to expel one of these worms you can see in the slide here at the bottom. That's the Esophagostomus stephanostomum. And they can swallow on average up to 55 leaves per bout. I've seen or counted 100 leaves in one fecal deposit. So they can expel up to 50 parasites if they're really, really actively folding and swallowing these leaves. So it has a significant impact during the time of year when the number of parasites are increasing inside of their intestinal tract. So Esophagostomus can be treated by leaf swallowing within 6 hours being flushed out. And we also know from in vivo studies that the compounds in Vernonia amygdalina actually paralyze or kill parasites. So both of those may be working together or individually to control parasite levels of Esophagostomus. This shows the different sites across Africa that we have records for leaf swallowing to occur. So far, there's 40 different plant species that are being ingested by apes in Africa. And all of those 40 species have those rough hairs, those hairs of silica covering the surface of the leaves. None of those 40 species that we know that apes are folding and swallowing are smooth-leafed. So that seems to be the trait that all these different populations are picking up on. So I got interested in saying, well, apes in Africa can do this. How about other animal species? We all know that dogs, sometimes cats, will swallow grass. So I was curious, how about other primates, just to begin with? And sure enough, the white-handed gibbon in Kauai National Park are also folding and swallowing leaves with this rough surface. And they're expelling a different parasite species, but a similar life cycle within the host. So the similar effect seems to be applicable across species of parasites. And we see this happening in a number of different primate species as well. Also in Taiwan, a collaborative work that I did with a colleague there found that civet cats, a small mammal, are also folding and swallowing grass, and they're expelling yet another kind of parasite, a parasite that's peculiar to these small carnivores, that they're able to expel by folding and swallowing these leaves without chewing them, without digesting them. Okay, so now I'll move on to mode 4. This is non-ingestive medicinal behavior. And some of the earliest examples we have for that are fur rubbing. You know that primates in Central America will take things like citrus or just overall generally smelly or very strong smelling plants. They'll chew on them and then they'll rub the saliva, or they'll take the plant part itself and rub over their bodies, sometimes over the bodies of their group mates. And it was hypothesized in the beginning that perhaps there's some kind of ectoparasitic expulsion property. And over time, analyzing the different compounds and things, that appears to be what the main function of this behavior is. We have examples in Cebus, Atilis, Aotus. In other mammals, again, we see the same behavior, the coati from Central and South America and the brown bear from the Northern Hemisphere. Within other primates, in the lemurs, in Cebus, Aotus, they're using millipedes, not just plants, but millipedes, and birds are very well known for using ants in a behavior called anting behavior. And these insects are exuding these very toxic chemicals, acids, and so that appears to be applied to the body to expel ectoparasites. In 2008, the first example of self-medication from orangutan in Indonesia was reported by Helen Morgo Bernard, and she talked about this habit of orangutan crushing the leaves of this plant. At that time, it was identified as a Commelina species. It's since been re-identified. But she noticed that the orangutan were chewing on those leaves and rubbing it mainly on their joints. So she wasn't quite sure what was going on, but she knew that, again, the local people living in the same forest used that same plant to treat inflammation on their joints. If you live in a humid climate, they can get cold, can be hot. You have a lot of fluctuating temperatures and things. Arthritis, things like that are probably a very common ailment. So she was thinking that maybe orangutan as well are applying this plant to their joints to ease pain or discomfort. So there was a second paper that came out in 2017 by members of the same group and some collaborators of mine from the Czech Republic. And sure enough, they were able to demonstrate that it did have a very significant anti-inflammatory effect. If you take this plant and crush it up and put it on your joint, they had a special model to look at its effect on cells, and they were able to demonstrate this anti-inflammatory effect. And interestingly, the behavior is most common in adult males who have a lot of weight, and they put a lot of pressure on their arms when they're walking around. So they hypothesized that, like the humans in this forest, the orangutan are also using these compounds to ease the pain of inflammation in the joints. So this is another example, a new kind of example, not associated particularly with parasites, but something, again, another way that animals can be using these plant compounds to make their lives a little bit better. And here's some examples of fumigation behavior. You see a broad range of different animal species. There's two reports, one for chimpanzees and one for orangutan, of adding plants with strong smells in the nest, and those compounds have an effect of keeping mosquitoes away. We know that great apes have malaria. Sometimes they even catch the same malaria as humans, and that they suffer in the same way that people do with fevers and whatnot. So some people are suggesting that chimpanzees line their nest with plants that keep away biting insects. A study from southern India, from the University of Madras, I think, a young graduate student was studying the behavior of short-nosed fruit bats, and he noticed that they were chewing on this plant and they were pasting it on the inside of their leaf tent. And he was familiar with the self-medicative research, so he wrote to me and we started discussing some of the possibilities. But he wrote up a really nice paper showing how fruit bats are also lining their nests to try and keep biting insects away. There's a really nice study done in the 90s showing how wood rats were also put bay leaf, a very fragrant leaf, into their stick nests like that, and they were able to demonstrate that that keeps down bacteria. A number of raptor species are also known to line their nest when they're raising their chicks with these plants that have antibacterial properties. But it wasn't until this study in 2013 by Suarez Rodriguez and colleagues in Mexico City that it really became clear of the impact of lining your nest with something that has a fumigation property that can keep away ectoparasites. And what this group of students did, when they realized that sparrows were lining their nests with cigarette butts, and you have to realize that cigarette butts, after they've been used, are packed full of nicotine, and nicotine is one of the world's earliest antiparasitic compounds. It's effective against malaria as well. But what they did was they had this population of sparrows, and half of the nests with chicks, they continually removed the cigarette butts. And the other half, they let the mother do as she would normally do. And periodically, they measured the weight of the chicks as they were developing. They were able to measure their parasite loads, and they also measured their weight when they left the nest and at what age they left the nest. And they found that a very significant difference occurred. Those chicks that were raised with these cigarette butts full of nicotine in the nest were fatter, they were healthier, they had fewer parasites, and they were able to fly out of the nest significantly earlier than those chicks who didn't have the benefit of these cigarette butts with the nicotine as they were growing up. There's also a paper that followed up that said there can be negative effects from too much nicotine. And of course, we know that in our own species for people that smoke too much. There's a carcinogenic effect from nicotine as well. But if the proper dosage in the right time, it can have a very positive benefit, especially for birds that are developing in the nest. Now, I talked briefly a second ago about capuchin monkeys and self-medication. I don't know how many of you know about another capuchin monk. The slide. Anyway, there was a picture of a Capuchin, a Catholic monk, making beer. And beer back in the 16th, 17th century was an alternative to water because water wasn't always clean. But if you fermented this beverage, which we call beer, you were able to get your liquids, but you were also able to feel good after drinking your beer. And it turns out that a number of different animal species are also consuming alcohol as an antiparasitic treatment. There was a nice study in Current Biology in 2012 talking about the control of bloodborne parasites injected as eggs by this parasitoid wasp into Drosophila. But because Drosophila are consuming fermented fruit, that alcohol content was enough to suppress the development of these parasitoid wasps. Now, shifting gears a little bit, talking about how animals use the plants. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the plants, how they're used by people, and what we can learn from that, and what we've already learned from this work with animal self-medication, and learn from local cultures about what they know about animal self-medication and how they've incorporated that into their daily lives. This gentleman in the screen is Moshi Bunengwa, and he's holding up a branch of Vernonia amygdalina. This young flexible branch is the part that the chimpanzees will take. They'll peel off the bark and the leaves, and they'll chew on that soft pith on the inside. They'll only suck out the very bitter juice and spit out the rest of the fibers. So they're only going after this juice, and that juice has all these bioactive compounds that are effective against a broad range of different parasites. But there's a number of different uses that humans are using this for. I'm sorry, the slide might be difficult to read. It's not important so much what is all written down here, just the fact that there's so many different uses that people have found for Vernonia amygdalina that really goes to demonstrate the bioactive properties and the potential for them to be used as medicine. Some of the early work that we did when we were trying to understand the compounds and their potential effectiveness against chimpanzees, we looked at their anti-schistosomal properties, anti-tumoral, antimicrobial activities, all very significant and interesting properties. It got some attention by other plant chemists, and over the years we've seen that other people have looked at the anti-cancer properties, for example. And this is a patent published in 2005 from Jackson State University in Missouri for an aqueous infusion of the leaves of Vernonia amygdalina as an effective treatment against breast cancer. They were able to demonstrate the anti-cancer properties, and so they took out a patent on the application of that. More interestingly, very, very recently, this was in, I don't see the year for this. It was just a few years ago, I think maybe 2017. But another plant, Centranthurus anthelminthicum, this is commonly used in India in the Ayurvedic treatment of fever, cough, and diarrhea. But the same compounds, vernodolin, that are found in Vernonia amygdalina are also in this plant. So they decided to look at the anti-cancer properties based on some of our research and the research of other people that have followed and done these things. And in this case, the technology for monitoring and looking at the actual mechanisms of the anti-cancer effect were possible. And they were able to demonstrate that this actually turns off the genetic switch for people that have, for women that have the gene that makes them more susceptible to breast cancer. They were able to demonstrate that simply by taking this compound, they were able to turn off that switch and make these women not susceptible to breast cancer. There's been a number of other studies that have also looked at anti-cancer properties. A number of different cancers seem to be treatable using these compounds within Vernonia amygdalina. This is Mohammadi again, and he was one time explaining to me how his grandfather learned about a new medicine by watching the behavior of porcupines. We see here in the bottom these crested porcupines. His grandfather came across one that was not doing well, and it appeared to be suffering from blood in the stools. And he followed it around, and he saw it dig up the roots of this plant that they call mulengelele. Now, up until that point, the Watongwe knew the plant, but it was poisonous, and no one did anything with it. They didn't even think about using it for medicine. But Mohammadi's grandfather saw that the porcupine dug up and chewed on the roots and got better within a few days. He was very curious as to what was going on, so he followed. And from that point on, he began to use this plant as a treatment for people in his village. And this was something like maybe 70 years ago. And now the use of this plant has spread throughout Western Tanzania amongst the Tongwe. Maybe it's gone to other tribes as well. But the last time that I talked to Mohammadi before he passed away in 2013, he was telling me that traditional healers further away from medical outposts and things were using mulengelele to treat secondary infections in AIDS patients. It's not a treatment or a cure for AIDS, but it seems to be a very potent antibiotic. So again, this is another interesting example of the potential of plants that we can gain by watching the behavior of sick animals. So traditional healers, not just the Watongwe, but in many different countries have this idea that we can learn about new medicines from watching animals. I think I'm running close to the end of my time here. Here's just one more example. In North America, the bear is a very important animal. He's a god to many different indigenous tribal peoples in North America. And there's a plant called Osha. This is Digisticum porteri. It's an Apiaceae. They call it bear root or Osha. And they note that like the orangutan, the bear will dig up the roots of this plant, chew on it, and then rub it not just in its joints, but all over its body. And the Navajo say that they got their use of the medicine from watching the behavior of this bear. But basically, we know now from the chemical composition of this plant that it's antibacterial, antiviral. And so it's used in a number of different interesting ways. It can be used for sore throats, bronchitis, cough, common cold, influenza, swine flu, and pneumonia. It's also been used to treat other viral infections, including herpes and HIV, AIDS. And this is what's really interesting. Here's another plant. It's very, very similar. It's within the same family of Apiaceae. The first plant I showed you grows at high altitudes. This plant grows in lower, drier areas, but in North America. And it's also a very important medicinal plant to the indigenous people of the area. I couldn't find any records of how they came across this plant, but it's possible that because it's very similar to Osha, that they use it for the same properties. And again, it's been shown that the chemical compounds, the active ingredients are the same in this plant as in Osha. But what's really interesting about this plant is that in the last pandemic, 1919 Spanish flu epidemic, the pandemic, the Washoe tribe in Nevada were using this plant to treat respiratory infections, to treat that influenza H1N1. And at the same time, people in other surrounding areas that didn't have that medicine, that didn't know about that medicine, of course, were dying or were severely affected. But doctors, medical doctors that came in to try and treat the people realized that no one in that tribe that was taking this medicine ever died, and that their symptoms were much reduced. And from what we know now about the activities of these compounds, this may be something that can be used to treat COVID-19 or future coronaviruses. The activities seem to be very, very significant. So again, this just goes to show what we have to learn from watching the behavior of all the animals that are on the planet today. They're here because they survived. They have gone through natural selection, and their diets have been refined and are, as we see, based on different things that are in their habitats, different types of diseases, different types of energy constraints, a number of different things. So we really have a lot to learn from all of these different species. And I think by looking back at how these behaviors have evolved, we can come up with a paradigm for how we can move forward and hopefully move forward in a healthier fashion. Thank you so much for your attention.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, sir. That was a very interesting talk. We have few questions. Can I ask them?
Of course, of course.
Dr. Chetan Nag from Bangalore, his question is...
Yes. Hi, Chetan.
Okay, so do we find evidences of self-medication in primates from South India? Any papers which you could suggest in this regards?
They haven't been written yet, but I'm sure it's happening. I guarantee it's happening. People just need to go out and collect the diet. If we have lists of what the animals are eating, and we have an idea about their health, what kind of parasites they have, what other things that put pressure on their life, I'm sure that we'll have examples of self-medication. One interesting example from the north, Shilajit, a very famous medicine in Ayurvedic tradition. Shilajit, that was apparently discovered by watching langurs chew on the gum that comes from in between the rocks. And Himani, a student of mine, has seen that at her site in the Garhwali Himalayas. So I'm sure it's everywhere. So that's another study waiting to be done. But in the South, I'm sure. Anywhere, I'm sure.
Wow.
It just has to be done.
So I'm going to wait. Well, I will read out Chetan Nag's response later if he sends any. I'm just going to move on to the next question. It's from Phu Phang Tu from Vietnam. In the wild, how do rhesus macaques self-treat scabies, parasitic infections, or injuries? Again,
no one studied that yet, but what we know from Japanese macaques, who are very closely related, there's something, probably multiple things in the diet that could help that. I don't know if anyone has specifically studied scabies in wild populations of rhesus, but the only thing that's stopping us from knowing about that is someone going there and watching and checking it out. I'm sure that they're doing something in response to that. What is whoever's watching those monkeys, that's what they get to find out.
The next question is from Ram. Do you think next generation sequencing of primate feces can help us discover more medicinal plant parasite diversity or load associations? Has there been any studies like that?
Nothing with next generation sequencing in this perspective. Some of the work that I do with host parasite relationships, we're doing a genetic work to identify parasites in a more specific level. But we haven't used that to look at the parasites yet. We have a project we've been proposing for a couple of years now in Sri Lanka with Charmely to look at differences in host parasite associations across the subspecies of toque macaques or purple-faced langurs. So I think there's some interesting potential to look at that in that way. Again, if Ram is into that, why not start?
I guess Ram would be more than thrilled. New ideas. Next question is from Professor Meva Singh.
Hi, Meva.
You're-
How are you?
So his question is this knowledge in animals socially transmitted, or has it become hardwired in evolutionary time?
Both. This is a question I've been trying to answer for a long time and slowly getting some ideas. Different parts of the behavior are socially transmitted. I'm sure Mewa knows more than I do about how young learn about what to eat from watching their mothers. All primates that we study, we know that the infants are like sponges, like human children. Everything they see adults do, they copy. So an animal living in the forest has to learn from its mother what plants to put in its mouth. And the only difference between medicine and food is what those different plants, how they make you feel afterwards. With food, it's very, very rapid. You feel satiated. You taste something sweet. You have energy. You perk up. If you've been really hungry and tired and you eat, then you get your strength back. With medicine, that takes a little bit more time. So the feedback mechanism is delayed. And just from what I've seen with chimpanzees in Mahale, it takes a young chimpanzee maybe 3 or 4 years before it's doing the behavior properly as adults do. And I don't think that the first time they take that plant, they have any idea why they're doing it other than, well, mom put it in her mouth, so I'll put it in my mouth. But we know with leaf swallowing, with bitter pith chewing, and a behavior I haven't talked about, geophagy, eating of clay, that the effect, it takes different amounts of time for the effect. With leaf swallowing, within 6 hours, you're flushing out the parasite. So they may feel different in that period of time. With bitter pith chewing, it's 20 to 24 hours. With geophagy, it's probably instantaneous, just like food, because it's a chalk or a clay that's coating the stomach, or it's absorbing things that give you an acidy stomach. So the individual has to learn the properties of the medicinal plants through personal experience. I think that's my thinking right now. But wherever you're living, you have to learn what specific plants in your habitat can you use in what way. So that part of the behavior is socially transmitted. But some experiments that we've done with captive animals, with captive chimpanzees, we've shown that they can pick up or reinvent this habit of leaf swallowing. And part of that seems to be based on the structure of the leaves, that rough structure. That roughness allows the leaf to easily be folded and swallowed instead of chewed. So there are affordances of the plants, but also this hardwired part that Mewa is asking about is also bitter tastes and some of these other things that a broad range of animals can associate with certain properties, and that's probably hardwired. When you don't feel right, you have a tendency to want to eat a certain kind of thing, and that craving may be based or enforced by culture, but it's also hardwired. So that's a lot of long explanation, but I think both of those things are happening simultaneously in any species that we know about so far. What percent is socially transmitted and what percent is hardwired will probably differ from a chimpanzee down to a bumblebee or a Drosophila fly consuming fermented fruit. So trying to figure out that formula is something that's always chewing at my brain here.
Thank you, sir. I mean, that was great interest. So we have a follow-up question related to what you just explained. It's from Saravanan. Does an individual primate figure out the therapeutic properties of plant parts using trial and error method, or taught by other individuals already aware of them, or a combination of both? I think it's a combination of both, right?
Yeah.
I'll let
Well,
you answer.
individual learning is different from trial and error. I don't think there's trial because they're learning bit by bit. The opportunity to see self-medication by an observer and by a chimp is very, very rare. It's not something they do every day simply because of what it is. So an infant may see self-medication for the first time, bitter pith chewing or leaf swallowing the first time during the first rainy season of its life. And then it will have to wait until the next rainy season to see it again. But it's probably the second rainy season that they begin to take these plants and play around with them because mom's doing it. But if you watch, they put them in the wrong direction, or they sometimes they take the wrong plant that's next to the plant. So that's not real trial and error, because that suggests that they know what they're trying to do, but they're making a mistake. In this case, they're just copying. So they're probably learning by chance that when they eat this, because their mom just ate it and they don't feel well, but over a couple of years, they've reached the stage where they can conceptualize what just happened to them, for example. So it's not really trial and error. I understand the use of that word, where Saravanan is coming from when that's presented, but I think it's just experience. But there's no teaching by the mother to do this, or the mother doesn't give them something when the mom thinks they're not feeling good. So it's not that kind of exchange either. It's mainly one way. Look at what mom does and do it, or what your big sister or your big brother does. That's the strongest drive, I think, the strongest motivation for any animal to learn new things, that drive to be like others, to behave like the others.
Thank you. And the next question is from Krishna Pitwa. Have you seen them consuming different types of mushrooms as medicine?
Not in primates yet. There's some mushroom consumption. It's a very interesting question. I'm writing a review paper now looking at different plants that humans have acquired by watching animals, and there are a couple hallucinogenic plants. The magic mushroom found across the northern hemisphere is one of those. A lot of hunter-gatherers, seal hunters that live in the north, people that herd reindeer, have watched reindeer pick up and eat these mushrooms and kind of act funny. Whether the reindeer is eating these mushrooms as medicine or just as food or what, I don't know of anyone that has actually studied it in that depth, But humans have certainly watched that, and they've taken it as a way to expand their mind, to talk to spirits, to learn about things, to gain one group of people say to gain courage. They see that bear will also eat the same mushroom. And when bears mate, there's a lot of aggression. It's competition between males and between the male and the female. Sometimes even in the Himalayan, with the Himalayan brown bear, the mating season coincides just before the hibernating season when a mother is raising her cubs. So if the mother has cubs, she's not interested in mating with this guy. So there's a lot of aggression going on. And some people in these societies that have watched the bears eat the mushrooms are saying that the males take the mushroom to give them confidence. I'm not sure what it does to them psychologically, but apparently to the humans who take it, it also gives them courage to take that quest to talk to the spirit world. So a lot of things are being picked up by people looking at the behavior of animals. Some of that is humans' interpretation of what the animals may be doing. But mushrooms as medicine, again, is a topic that no one's really looked at so far. People have asked me that before, and I haven't had the opportunity to look at, to see mushrooms being eaten that often. So, Krishna Pitwa, if you want to know that question, that's a good one. You should go and look at it.
So we are coming up with lots of research ideas during the discussion. Wow. That's interesting. So the next question is from Kunal. Do these things in Tanzania eat plants not as medicinal but as a recreational drug, maybe due to halogenic properties of these plants?
I've never seen that.
Hallucinogenic, sorry.
I've never seen that. But in Central Africa, there's a plant, Tabernanthe iboga, and the hunter-gatherers living in that area have seen bush pigs, gorillas, chimpanzees chew on the fruit or the root, chew on this plant and run around scared like they're being chased by something. So that information got passed on to agriculturalists in the area who have this association with the hunter-gatherers, and they use it as a ritual within their society as an initiation for young men. And it's a hallucinogenic drug. So we do know from this one case that these three animal species are ingesting a plant and behaving as if they're hallucinating, as if they're seeing things that aren't there. Interestingly, in North America, there's research on that compound, on that plant and the compounds from it, especially ibogaine, which is a compound derived and named after iboga, that is being used as a non-addictive alternative to methadone for people who are drug addicts. So this has been verified from many different angles that it is a hallucinogen. We know that it's not addictive in humans, but we know that it brings on hallucinations. Mahale chimpanzees I've never seen them do it, but someone has in those gorillas and those bush pigs and chimpanzees in Central Africa. But at one site, this was reported a long time ago, but no one has gone back to study. So again, any of you guys want to go to Africa and study iboga?
I wouldn't mind. So Ram has a follow-up question from Professor Meva Singh's and Saravana's question. Could primates be learning about medicinal properties of plants by observing other species?
I don't know why not. I don't have any evidence that that's the case. but we certainly know that our species has learned from other species, many other species. I guess we'd have to try and find examples in the forest of different species using the same plant for the same thing. And so far, the only examples we have are humans and primates. Human primates and non-human primates.
Yes.
But every species is self-medicating, so there's a lot to look for.
Yes. Kunal has another question. In the documentary, it was said that these medicines can be useful to treat some important human diseases. But don't you think it will lead to rampant exploitation of already overexploited forests?
Good point. Luckily, the plants that I've talked about, especially Vernonia amygdalina, is being grown now around the world. It's been being grown in Malaysia. It's grown in Australia. You can buy seeds from Amazon.com and grow it in your gardens if you want. It's not an endangered species. It grows in secondary forests that are already changing and in fluctuation. If I knew of a plant that was the ultimate cure to everything, and it was rare and in the forest, I wouldn't tell anybody.
Probably you aren't.
I couldn't wake up and look at myself in the mirror if I was responsible for the destruction of a plant or a habitat like that.
So
it's possible that could happen. Yeah.
Yes, very much possible, sir.
Yeah.
The next question, this is actually from Titir. So this next question is from Titir, who's part of AIP. Is there any self-medication strategy used by primates, particularly the greater and lesser apes, to treat psychological problems or maybe to reduce stress?
Again, we don't have any behavioral observations for that in great apes or lesser apes, but I published a paper with colleagues from China last year. I can share that with anybody that's interested. With Tibetan macaques, they have a very intense social structure and a lot of competition between males and males for females. They're fairly, they seem on the surface fairly mellow. Male interactions are kind of not like rhesus or Japanese macaques, a little more egalitarian. But they're doing a lot of social maneuvers to reduce stress. And there's one Chinese one herbal medicine that they're eating in the spring, which is it's right when the birth season and the mating season is ending and beginning. And Tibetan macaques are very interesting. They're seasonal breeders. Physiologically, they're restricted into when they can have fertile offspring, but they're mating almost year round. And they're ingesting a plant when at the end of the mating season, when reproductively they're not functioning, that enhances sexual activity, but also reduces stress. They've been able to demonstrate this in very nice models using rats, I think, but looking at fluctuation in hormonal levels, looking at different indicators of reproductive function. So that's a possibility. One plant that is prescribed daily to people across China for stress and for some of these other properties. And the Tibetan macaques are using them at the perfect time to have that kind of effect, if that's what they're using it for.
Kunal has a follow-up. He has a comment from his first question. In central India, we see animals like bears, elephants, and primates eating mahuasi flowers, that is Maduka longifolia. mainly due to their hallucinogenic properties. So maybe that's why he asked you the question.
Well, no, let's see some observations here. That sounds very interesting.
Well, you can put more if you have any. I'm going to move on to the next question. It is from Rusana Pradhan. I had read somewhere dogs eat grass when they have upset stomach, and elephants eat a variety of babul plant that helps them to release oxytocin that helps during childbirth. How do animals know that?
I don't know how they know it. That's one of the big mysteries. But I do know of other examples. There's a really cool paper that was just published this year by a guy in Florida. And he looked through all the literature, all the carnivores that eat grass, that ingest fiber. So it's a very widespread behavior. I've seen grass eating in leopards and lions in Mahale. Dogs and cats do this. I've talked to veterinarians in Tanzania who have seen dogs, wild and feral, chew up grass and then expel parasites out the other side, like leaf swallowing. I've never heard about the babul plant, but there are examples again in elephants in Africa ingesting plants that induce labor. I don't know if oxytocin helps in childbirth. Usually when you give birth, then your oxytocin levels increase, and that's responsible for the mother-infant bond. But I've read somewhere that there is one plant that's associated with increased oxytocin. I'm trying to think of the plant. But all of these examples, all these really cool examples that people are giving, is the perfect clue, the perfect cue to go out and study them as animal scientists to see what's going on. And we can't learn enough about all of this.
Yes, sir. So that would be the last question of the day. But I would like to, there's a message from Dr. Dilip Chetri from Northeast. He says it's a very interesting and informative talk, which we all feel the same. And he thanks you and AIP for organizing the event. On this note, I would like to say, good medicine tastes bitter, but the talk was sweeter. On behalf of Association of Indian Primatologists, I would love to thank Dr. Huffman for the wonderful and very informative medicinal talk. I would also like to thank our viewers from across the world for the support and fruitful interactions with our speakers, which possibly has led to the new topics and emergence of new era of projects on medicinal plants and the primates. Our next talk is on the 22nd of August in the evening at 7 p.m. It's going to be from Professor Inga Kone. He is a professor of conservation biology at University Felix Ho Fu, Bune Abidan. He is also the president of the Association of African Primatological Society. He is going to be talking to us about community empowerment for the conservation of endangered primates in Southeastern Africa. So would you have, yes, do you have any last words, or final words before we part?
Well, thank you all for listening. And if even one of you starts studying animal self-medication, I'll be a happy man. Thank you very much.
It was an honor to have you on board, sir. Thank
Likewise.
you.